sure am I on? Okay. So, speaking of drones, and I've never said that before. Speaking of drones, it's been a hot button issue, particularly during the confirmation proceedings for recently confirmed Defense Secretary Charles Hagel and CIA Chief Nominee John Brennan. The Obama administration has employed and even built on a late Bush administration policy of killing terrorist suspects with drone strikes, and recently taken a lot of heat after a leaked memo for what it called the lawful drone killings of Americans with suspected terrorist ties. So I wondered if you might give us a little bit of your view about why there's been actually so little difference between the Bush administration and the Obama administration's official position on drones, and where you kind of see the power of this new technology going.
Well, I think there's little difference because a lot of the differences that go on in the government are between the executive branch and the legislative branch, actually more so than even between the parties. And this is particularly true when you deal with issues like the war on terror or foreign policy in general. There has been a steady stream of thought in recent decades on a lot of these issues amongst what I would call Washington political class Republicans and Democrats. And when someone becomes president, they like the idea of consolidating power. And the reason they like it is because they think of themselves as good. And everyone likes to think of themselves as a good person. And so it's not a matter of President Obama being a bad person or President Bush being a bad person. That's not why we want to remove or return power to Congress, return authority back to the people through the Constitution. It's because we don't believe in this country that the executive branch or any individual should have the kind of power that they want to claim. Because you want to provide for those circumstances in which something extraordinary could happen. You could have someone who wants to do ill will upon the American people who is in power. And you want to limit their ability to do so. So I think it's just a matter of people thinking of themselves as good human beings, and that's a natural tendency, and that's why they feel they should have this power. And the same happens in Congress, but there's more of a check in Congress because you have 435 representatives. But in Congress, you see the same thing. You see people who say, well, we will vote for giving the president this authority because the people we know in government, they're all good people. They're our neighbors, they're our friends, they're not going to do anything nefarious.
So what did you think about the leaked memo, though, and why aren't we seeing more members of the Republican Party speaking up then against drone use?
Well, in the Republican Party, there's still a pretty clear split. There's a lot of members who've been there for many years who, but they were following the same policies essentially under the Bush administration. They've been consistent in their statements for many years and been consistent in their votes, and they're not likely to suddenly, when you have a Democratic president, then announce that they're against these policies, because they figure we'll have a Republican president again some way, and we like these things. We like the executive branch to have this kind of control. So you're not going to get a lot of pressure, enough pressure from the Republican side other than from the more libertarian Republicans. On the Democratic side, I think you've had a deafening silence. There have been a few people who have spoken up against the administration's policies, but it's been amazingly quiet. We used to have Dennis Kucinich in the House, who I know many Republicans did not like him, but I always found him to be a good friend and ally on many issues, and was someone who was brave enough to speak up about things that others were not willing to speak up about.
So why don't you think that there are legitimate use of a legitimate use of a weapon in the war on terror? Where do you draw the lines? Where do you draw the Constitution?
I think there is legitimate use of drones. There's a legitimate use of F-16s, and there's legitimate use of guns. There's legitimate use of all sorts of weapons, provided they are used in a war setting. I don't have a problem with the government using them, but the definition of war has changed. So they are operating under the Afghanistan Authorization for Use of Military Force. Basically, what the administration is doing is saying that the Afghanistan war allows them to use drones in places that are around the world, not Afghanistan, use them against people who are not actively engaged in combat against the U.S., and they've changed the meaning of imminent to not mean immediate. So if there's, they call things an imminent threat even when it's not imminent. And of course, if someone is firing rockets at our soldiers somewhere, and we've got a drone flying overhead, we can bomb them. I don't have a problem with that. That's called war. And if you're in a war and that happens, that's a normal military operation. What's not acceptable is the idea that drones might be used to attack someone who's not in combat, and particularly a U.S. citizen who's not in combat. That could be overseas, but the most unsettling thing is domestically. It hasn't been clear from the administration whether they can be used domestically, and they've, I think, tried to settle things down by issuing a statement after Rand Paul did his filibuster, but I'm still not sure what they mean.
So now there's increasing use of drones by private entities, local law enforcement. Will you push for privacy laws to regulate their use?
I think this is a very tricky area for someone who's looking at it from a more libertarian perspective. You want to allow private actors to operate freely with most of the things they do in life. You want people to be able to decide whether they drive a car here, whether they own a gun, and drones. The private use of drones is something that I think you need to look at as protecting. But at the same time, I do have concerns about privacy violations. And so there may be a need going forward for an expansion of privacy laws, preferably at the state level, to ensure that people aren't using drones in ways that will violate other people's privacy. So it's not to me as much of a rights issue as much as it is of a general privacy issue.
So will you push for privacy protections? Are you considering sponsoring any legislation?
I think it's an area that I need to look more carefully at, and it would depend on the particular bill and the particular language of the bill. So I couldn't give a blanket answer about whether I sponsor particular regulations on private use of drones, but I think there's a case to be made for that.
Okay, we'll be back.
Yeah.
We'll be back on that one. All right, indefinite detention, turning to another really fun topic. It's been a contentious issue since the policy's insertion first in the 2011 National Defense and Authorization Act. The policy allows for wartime jailing of terrorist suspects and other accused belligerents without trial. Last year, you co-sponsored the Smith-Amash amendment to the NDAA, thank you. And putting aside party differences, your amendment sought to make clear that the United States is off limit to indefinite military detention and that military commissions could not be used for civilians in the United States. You put together a bipartisan group and a broad range of groups from the ACLU to Gun Owners of America to the United Methodist Church endorsed it. Can you tell us more about why you're taking this position and what's been the political cost for you? You're still a relatively junior member of Congress. You're carved out a place for yourself here that is both a leadership role, but also a bit of a upstart. So, what have been the ramifications of your taking that kind of a position?
Well, taking the position was not difficult. I want to protect the rights of individuals. Our Constitution ensures that our rights are protected, and I want to follow the Constitution. That's my job as a member of Congress. So it's not difficult to see that if there's a law in place that violates people's protected rights, that we should do away with it, and the NEA clearly does that. Some of the ramifications, of course, are that you have people in your own party who will attack you. I certainly took a lot of heat from people who have been there for, been in office for a while, some of the more senior members who have followed a certain, they've had a certain viewpoint since the days of the Bush administration about what should be done to deal with alleged terrorists. And of course, they put out statements saying that my positions would reward Al-Qaeda, and there's a lot of negative statements made by people in my own party. But I don't mind. That's my job. My job is to go out there and protect people's rights. And at the end of the day, I think the public, if you talk to people, Republican, Democrat, Independent, they know what's right and what's wrong. So if I have 90+% of the public behind me and they've got 10% and they want to call me names, that's their business. But at the end of the day, I'm going to win the argument.
So you just keep plugging away.
Yeah, absolutely.
So speaking of Guantanamo, I mean, that was an issue on which the president came in pretty determined to close Guantanamo. It's not been entirely successful. There was a lot of pushback. You were an early supporter of closing Guantanamo. What's your sense about what's going to happen there, and why we've not been able to make any progress?
Well, I think until you deal with some of these other issues, particularly those related to U.S. citizens, I don't think you're going to get to the Guantanamo issue. Because people are, the public is most concerned, and you've had the most upswing in support for protecting the rights of citizens. And a lot of Americans will look at something like Guantanamo and say, well, we're housing foreigners there. These are people who were allegedly at war with our country, and so it's okay to keep them there forever. I think that's a mistaken viewpoint. I think you have to, when you're fighting a war, you fight the war and you get it over with. You can't have an ongoing war that lasts forever and detain people as prisoners of war, essentially, forever. You have to give people at some point a chance to either, you have to either prove that they're guilty or release them. And unfortunately, that's not what's going on. But we're not going to get to that issue really until we get to the citizens issue. And I think that's a priority for me, making sure that American citizens are protected first.
So no more gossip here about. I'm looking for what is it on the national political landscape that's going to have to change, do you think?
Well, you have to have you elect a president who says he's going to close it and then he does close it. That would be a first step. But after President Obama's, President Obama said a lot of things that haven't come true, and I think from a civil liberties standpoint, he's been very harmful to our country, more harmful than President Bush. And I say this knowing that President Bush did a lot to harm civil liberties during his time in office. But President Obama came in with the promise of reviving civil liberties, protecting our rights. He would not use, indefinite detention. He made a lot of promises that just have not held up. And then find out he's got a kill list that has, at least in the past, had Americans on it. So you've got to have people who get elected who you can trust on these issues. I could think of a few, but I won't get into that here.
Well, I can't help but say I respectfully disagree with that statement. Having lived through the 8 years of the Bush administration, there's really been no comparison in terms of violations of civil liberties. Warrantless wiretapping, National Security Administration, the Patriot Act, don't even get me started.
But all those things are continuing under President Obama.
Well, and I'm not. The ACLU has been a critic of the Obama administration. We've been very consistent in sustaining our objections to a number of the kind of post-9/11 anti-terrorism policies. So I'm not vacillating, but I just am disagreeing with your overall assessment about the impact of the two administrations. I mean, that was a pretty horrific time.
Well, to be clear, I just want to make sure my point is clear. I think the problem, the reason I think President Obama has done more damage is because of the expectations that were set. I don't think anyone had high expectations that President Bush was going to protect our civil liberties. But when President Obama was elected, even though I'm a Republican, I was hopeful that at least he would pare back some of the civil liberties violations. And I get to Congress, and one of the first things we're voting on is extending the Patriot Act. And the person who said he would sign it was President Obama. And actually, the first time the Patriot Act came through in Congress after I was elected, came up for an extension, they put it on suspension, which means that they basically eliminated debate on it, and but in exchange you have to get 2/3 of members of Congress to pass it, and they put it on suspension and it failed because they were shocked to find these libertarian Republicans coming in who were against the Patriot Act. They didn't expect it, so they actually didn't. When they did their whip count, they didn't account for us that we would vote no on it. I remember the leadership coming to me and saying, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm following the Constitution." But of course, ultimately it passed. They put it on regular order, and it passed, and it was signed. And you've had other things signed, like the NDAA, and I think that they've both been very harmful to civil liberties in different ways.
Yes. I would agree. All right, so let's turn to immigration reform. I know it's an issue very much on people's minds. And obviously, I think the country is ready in many respects for finally taking it on in a big way. You recently wrote a letter to Rand Paul expressing support for, I think your term was reasonable immigration reform. And if I'm wrong in the term reasonable, correct me. Yeah. But you addressed 3 specific areas: securing the borders, expanding legal immigration, and then addressing illegal immigrants currently in the United States. Would you, expand a little bit on those 3 bullet points, and then what happens if we can't secure the border? Because I think it's our position that you can't secure the border. So then, what happens to the rest of immigration reform?
Well, I think it's a critical first step that you secure the border. We have a country that people come in and they can receive many benefits. Thanks to our taxpayers in this country. And I think it's critical that we secure the border and make sure that that is a prerequisite to the other steps. Now, with that said, if you can get that step out of the way, I think you can bring a lot more conservatives on board with the other steps. And the other steps then are to provide for a better system to bring legal immigrants here. And for those who are not familiar with our immigration system, it's very difficult for someone to come to this country. My office often gets requests from the medical community. For example, right here